Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are dissecting the British Corn Laws, examining how artificial scarcity and protectionist tariffs on grain fueled immense wealth for landowners while simultaneously driving widespread poverty, starvation, and ultimately accelerating the Industrial Revolution by forcing a shift from agriculture to manufacturing, fundamentally reshaping Britain's economic landscape. Let me start with a question that sounds simple until you really sit with it. When a war ends, what happens to the price of bread, and who gets to decide whether that price is allowed to fall? In this video, you are going to understand how a single issue, grain, not gold, not guns, grain, could sit at the center of politics, class tension, and economic change in Britain. Here on this first slide, we are standing right after the Napoleonic Wars, and the timing matters because wars do not just move armies, they rearrange entire economies. During wartime, trade routes are disrupted, supplies are uncertain, governments spend heavily, and prices, especially food prices, can surge and swing. Then peace arrives, soldiers come home, military demand collapses, and suddenly a country has to absorb a huge transition all at once. That post-war moment brings real economic shock. Unemployment rises as demobilized men look for work, industries adjust to new conditions, and prices can become unstable in ways that make ordinary life feel precarious. Now, why does grain become such a flashpoint in this environment? Because for working households in early 19th century Britain, bread is not a side item, it is the foundation. If the price of grain rises, the price of bread rises, and that is not a small inconvenience, that is the difference between security and anxiety for families living close to the edge. At the same time, landowners and many in agriculture have their own fear, and it is a rational fear from their perspective. During the war years, domestic grain prices tend to be high, and those high prices support rents, incomes, and the rural status quo. When peace returns and imported grain could flow more freely, prices might fall, and with them, the income tied to land could fall too. So you can already see the collision. Workers want affordable bread because it shapes daily survival, and landowners want to prevent a price collapse because it shapes their wealth and the system that sustains it. One more quick clarity point, because it matters for everything that follows. When people in Britain at this time say corn, they do not mean just what many modern listeners imagine. They mean grain more broadly, especially wheat, and wheat is the key input into the bread that anchors the diet. So in this post-war setting, grain prices become political because they link the farm, the city, the wage, and the dinner table into one nervous system. And once that linkage is felt, the next question becomes unavoidable: will policy be used to manage that linkage, and if so, whose stability will it protect first? In the year 1815, Britain takes that post-war anxiety we just described and turns it into a very specific legal mechanism, what became known as the Corn Law of 1815, and the key idea is a price barrier. Instead of simply letting grain arrive from abroad whenever it was cheaper, the law restricted imports unless the domestic price of grain rose to a stated threshold, which in plain language means this: when world supply could have pushed prices down, the law stepped in to block that pressure. Supporters presented this as a way to stabilize agriculture and protect rural society from a sudden crash, and you can see the logic if you imagine being a landowner or a farmer staring at peacetime imports and thinking, if prices fall fast, rents fall, incomes fall, and the whole countryside feels it. But notice what the system is doing. It is not just reacting to nature or harvests, it is deliberately insulating one set of producers from competition by writing scarcity into the rules. That insulation changes incentives. If higher domestic prices are protected by law, then the political energy of the groups who benefit from those higher prices will naturally flow into defending the barrier, because the gains are direct and the stakes are personal. Meanwhile, for households buying bread, the effect can be the opposite, because when you place a legal barrier between cheaper grain and the market, you are making it harder for prices to fall when they otherwise might. So the core effect of this 1815 law is not mysterious. It is a policy choice that cushions agriculture by keeping domestic grain prices less exposed to world prices, and the immediate moral and economic tension is built right into the design. Price stability for some can mean higher costs for others, and once a government creates a rule that holds prices above what open imports would allow, it is not just managing trade, it is deciding who bears the burden of adjustment in peacetime. The story gets even more revealing when you watch how the policy changes shape rather than disappearing, because after the original restrictions, Britain moves toward a system that tries to look technical and flexible, the sliding scale of 1828. Here is the basic idea in everyday terms. Instead of a simple on or off barrier, the duty on imported grain would rise or fall depending on the current domestic price. When domestic prices were low, the duties were set higher, making imports more expensive right when they would have been most competitive. When domestic prices were high, duties were set lower, allowing more imports, but only after the price had already risen. That sounds like a compromise, and on paper it can be sold as a stabilizer, but in practice it creates two powerful effects that matter for understanding everything on this slide: uncertainty and lobbying. Uncertainty, because traders, millers, and consumers now face a moving target. The cost of imported grain is not just about harvests and shipping, it is also about where the domestic price happens to fall on a schedule, which can change quickly and can be anticipated, gamed, and argued over. And lobbying, because once policy becomes a set of adjustable levers rather than a single fixed rule, interest groups have constant reasons to push, tweak, and defend those levers. Every shift in prices becomes a political moment. Every downturn becomes an argument to tighten protection. Every spike becomes a debate over whether relief should arrive through lower duties. The deeper point is that the sliding duty system does not remove politics from the grain market, it embeds politics into the grain market as a permanent feature, turning food policy into a continuous contest over who gets protected, when, and at what cost. If you want to understand why the corn laws became so emotionally charged, this slide is the heart of it, because it forces us to ask a simple distribution question: who gains, and who pays? Start with the clearest winner in the basic logic of the policy. When grain prices are kept higher than they otherwise might be under freer imports, the value of farmland tends to rise, and with it, the rental income that land can command. So landowners, especially those with political influence, have a direct channel from policy to income, not through productivity, but through a rule that props up the price of a staple. Tenant farmers can experience a more mixed reality, because higher grain prices can raise revenue, but rents and costs can rise too, and the exact outcome depends on local arrangements. But for the mass of people who buy bread rather than sell grain, the direction is much more straightforward. If the price of grain is elevated, then bread becomes more expensive, and that presses down on real wages, meaning what a wage can actually buy. Even if a worker's pay does not change on paper, the household budget gets squeezed in practice. Now bring in manufacturers, because industrial Britain is growing, and factory owners are not immune to food policy. When bread is expensive, workers need more money to maintain basic living standards, so wage pressure rises. That can mean higher labor costs for employers and less room to compete, especially in trade-exposed industries. So the policy does not just redistribute between farmer and baker. It can shift income toward land while burdening workers as consumers and pressuring industry through costs. And here is the political economy lesson hidden inside that pattern: concentrated benefits create focused defenders. Widespread costs create frustration, but that frustration is harder to organize, because it is spread across millions of meals and pay packets. Once you see that, the corn laws stop looking like a narrow trade rule and start looking like a system for deciding whose stability is purchased by whose daily expenses. When bread prices surge, politics stops being abstract and becomes physical, because this is the moment where an economic policy shows up on a kitchen table. A spike in grain prices does not just mean a slightly more expensive loaf. For a working household, it can mean fewer meals, weaker nutrition, and the constant stress of choosing what to cut first. And once you understand that, you can understand why price spikes so often coincide with protest and unrest. People do not need a full theory of trade policy to recognize the feeling of being squeezed by forces they cannot vote away, or to sense that rules are being written to protect one group while another group absorbs the pain. This is also why wages matter so much on this slide. If the cost of staple food rises faster than pay, real wages fall, meaning your wage buys less life, less warmth, less safety. Even if employers raise nominal wages, that is not guaranteed, and it often lags. That lag is where hardship turns into anger, and anger can turn into mobilization, petitions, demonstrations, and sometimes disorder. Now, as this pressure builds, debates about poor relief intensify, because the state is pushed into an uncomfortable position. If people cannot afford food, what is the responsibility of public policy, and what should be left to markets, charity, or local communities? In Britain, these arguments sharpen in the lead-up to the reforms of 1834, changes to the poor relief system that were meant to restructure how assistance worked. Historians debate how much any single policy, including grain protection, drove particular episodes of unrest or reform, so we should be careful about one-cause stories. But it is fair to say the incentives line up in a very human way. When staple prices rise and insecurity spreads, the social temperature rises too, and governments face pressure to respond, not only with relief rules, but with policing, messaging, and moral justification. And that leads to the moral friction at the bottom of this slide. A law framed as protecting stability and property can still produce hunger in the short run for those with the least slack, and once that contradiction becomes visible, the legitimacy of the system itself becomes part of the conflict. To see why the Corn Laws stayed in place for so long, you have to look at the political machine behind them, because policies like this do not survive on arguments alone, they survive on power, representation, and organization. In early 19th century Britain, the landed interest held enormous influence, not just socially but institutionally. Land was wealth, land was status, and land was political access. Before the major reforms of the 1830s, representation in Parliament did not mirror population in any modern sense, and that distortion mattered. Many growing industrial towns had limited representation, while some rural areas and small boroughs held outsized influence, which meant that the people most invested in protecting agricultural income could exert more control than their numbers alone would suggest. Now, this is not about assuming every landowner voted the same way or that every member of Parliament was a caricature, but it is about recognizing incentives built into the structure. If your constituency and your social network are deeply tied to land rents and rural stability, you have strong reasons to favor policies that keep grain prices high and predictable. Then comes a major shift, the Reform Act of 1832, which changes representation and expands participation. But here is the crucial point for this slide. Reform changes incentives, it does not instantly rewrite the entire political economy. Existing interests do not vanish, and a policy that delivers concentrated benefits still has dedicated defenders. So even after 1832, protection can persist because institutions change gradually, coalitions adapt, and people with a lot to lose fight hard to preserve the rules that protect them. In other words, the Corn Laws are not just a story about economics, they are a story about how the design of representation can determine whose economic fears get translated into law. Now, on this slide, we finally step into the economic reasoning that made repeal thinkable, because the case for freer trade was not just a moral appeal, it was also a structured argument about how an economy grows and how ordinary people live. Start with the most direct point. If imported grain is allowed to enter more freely, food can become cheaper than it would be under legal barriers, and when the staple food gets cheaper, real wages rise even if the pay packet stays the same, because a wage now buys more bread, more basic security, more room to breathe. That is why many classical economists treated food prices as foundational, because they shape the minimum cost of living, what we might call subsistence costs, and those costs ripple through everything else. If the cost of basic living is lower, workers are under less pressure to demand higher nominal wages simply to survive, and employers are under less pressure to raise wages just to keep workers afloat, which can reduce friction and make industry more competitive. Notice how this is not an argument about making workers accept less, it is an argument about making life less expensive at the most basic level, so that the struggle between wages and prices is not permanently stuck in crisis mode. Then there is the wider trade logic, comparative advantage. In plain language, the idea is that Britain can focus on producing what it becomes especially good at producing, particularly manufactured goods, and trade those goods for grain from places that can produce grain more efficiently or more abundantly. Under that logic, restricting grain imports is not just protecting farmers, it is also blocking a pattern of exchange that could raise overall living standards by letting each side specialize. You do not have to treat this as a perfect, automatic win for everyone, because distribution matters and transitions can be painful, but the core claim on this slide is clear. Freer trade in grain can be framed as pro-worker precisely because it targets the price of bread, the single cost that most directly determines whether wages feel like progress or like survival. This slide is where the story becomes unmistakably modern, because you see a national political movement using organization, media, and persuasion at scale, and that movement is the Anti-Corn Law League, founded in the year 1838. The reason it matters is not just that it opposed the Corn Laws, but how it opposed them. Instead of relying only on elite debate inside Parliament, the League built a public campaign that treated opinion itself as something you could shape deliberately, through mass meetings, petitions, pamphlets, fundraising, and local chapters that coordinated across towns and regions. In other words, they approached politics like a system, with inputs, messaging, networks, and resources, and they tried to change outcomes by changing incentives for decision makers. If enough voters, donors, merchants, and workers are mobilized, members of Parliament face a different political calculation. But the League's strategy also depended on translation. Trade policy can sound technical, and technical policies often survive because people do not have the time or language to fight them. The League worked to make the issue legible and urgent in everyday terms, connecting the price of grain to the cost of bread and the cost of bread to the dignity of ordinary life. This is where the moral and economic arguments start to reinforce each other. If protection raises food costs, the League could present repeal not as a narrow commercial change but as a broad social relief. And whatever you think about the League's motives, the historical point on this slide is solid. It shows how individual agency, multiplied by organization, can challenge entrenched policy. A law backed by powerful interests can still be pressured when the opposition learns how to coordinate, communicate, and persist. On this slide, we zoom in on the people and the message, because movements do not move without messengers, and two names become especially tied to the Anti-Corn Law League's public face, Richard Cobden and John Bright. What made their approach powerful was not secret information or complicated theory, it was clarity. They helped turn a technical trade policy into a simple household question by pushing the framing that stuck in the public imagination, the idea of a bread tax. That phrase matters because it tells the listener, in one breath, what the policy feels like in daily life, not just what it looks like in a tariff schedule. And once you frame it that way, the debate is no longer only about markets, it is about fairness, about whose interests the law is really serving, and about whether a government should make a basic staple more expensive by design. Cobden and Bright also connected free trade to a broader moral and social vision, often arguing that voluntary exchange across borders encourages cooperation rather than rivalry, and that prosperity built on open commerce carries a different kind of legitimacy than prosperity maintained by legal privilege. Now, you can agree or disagree with the tone of that vision, but the key point is historical and visible. The League's messaging was meant to be both economic and moral, and it was built to persuade people who were not specialists. They used speeches, pamphlets, meetings, and relentless repetition of simple cause and effect, so that ordinary voters could say, in plain language, what the policy does and why it matters. And here is the deeper lesson sitting right inside this slide: individual agency is real in history, not just as lone heroes, but as organizers and persuaders who learn how to make an argument travel from a lecture hall into a marketplace and then into the political arena. When enough people share a clear story about what a law is doing, and when that story links daily costs to public ethics, what once seemed untouchable can start to look negotiable. This slide is where ideas collide with crisis, because in the mid-1840s the debate over grain policy is no longer just a question of theory or fairness, it is happening under real pressure from a food shock. The potato blight begins in the year 1845 and continues into the late 1840s, and while the full story of suffering and government response is complex and heavily debated by historians, the immediate relevance here is straightforward. A staple food source fails, fear spreads, and the politics of imports and prices becomes urgent in a new way. In that environment, the question of whether Britain should keep restricting grain imports becomes harder to defend as a matter of routine, because the costs of scarcity feel sharper and the moral stakes feel higher. This is the moment when Robert Peel, who is Prime Minister at the time, moves toward repeal, and in the year 1846 the repeal passes. It is important to say this carefully. Repeal is not a single cause story with one lever, because political pressure, economic argument, party dynamics, and humanitarian concern all overlap. But what we can say with confidence, based on what this slide emphasizes, is that crisis changed the incentives and accelerated decisions that had been building for years. And Peel's decision carried a political price. It fractured his party, because protection was not just a policy preference for many, it was tied to identity, constituency, and fear of losing status and income. So repeal is both a policy pivot and a political rupture. The law changes, but the cost of changing it is paid inside the political system itself, and that is a reminder that major reforms often happen when the pressure becomes high enough that keeping the old rule becomes more expensive than breaking it, even for leaders who know they will take the hit. Now we step into the aftermath, and the responsible way to talk about it is with both clarity and restraint, because historians debate the size and timing of some effects, and the economy does not flip like a switch just because a law is repealed. Still, the broad direction emphasized on this slide is that after repeal, imports of grain rise and the domestic grain market becomes more connected to world supply than it was under strict protection. Over time, that increased access can help push prices downward compared with a world where the barriers remained, and when staple food becomes more affordable, that can support living standards in a very direct way. But this is also where distribution and adjustment matter. Agriculture does not simply vanish, it adapts, and different regions and producers experience change differently. Some feel relief from volatility, others feel new competition, and transitions can create real shocks even when the long-run trend looks beneficial. That is why the slide also keeps space for debate. Did protection slow growth significantly, or did it provide a kind of stability that some believed was socially necessary, at least in the short run? Different scholars weigh these questions differently depending on which data they emphasize and how they interpret causality. What we can say without overreaching is that the Corn Laws had clear distributional consequences while they existed, and repeal reduced one major legal barrier that had kept food markets more insulated. From there, the industrial and social transformation of Britain continues, shaped by many forces at once, but with a grain market that is now governed more by trade flows than by a protection schedule set to defend one class of asset. And that shift, even without claiming a perfect outcome, is historically significant because it changes the rules of the game for prices, wages, and political conflict going forward. This is the moment where we step back and ask what this entire Corn Laws story is really teaching us about systems, because the specific details are 19th century Britain, but the underlying mechanics show up again and again. One lesson is about incentives. When a policy creates concentrated gains, especially gains tied to something stable like land and rents, the people who benefit have a strong reason to defend that policy with time, money, and political effort, because the reward is direct and the loss from change feels personal. Meanwhile, the costs can be widely spread, showing up as slightly higher prices across countless households, so the burden is real but harder to organize into one unified force. Another lesson is about unintended outcomes. A rule designed to protect one group from instability can end up amplifying instability somewhere else, especially when it affects a staple like bread, because raising the cost of basic living does not stay contained inside an economic model. It spills into wages, into hardship, into social tension, and into the legitimacy people attach to the whole order. And that leads to the ethical question at the center of this slide. If scarcity is created or maintained by law, even with the stated goal of stability, how should we think about the morality of that choice when the consequences land on those with the least room to absorb them? Put differently, when protection is enforced through the coercive power of the state, who is being protected, and who is being required to pay for that protection in daily life? This is where the contrast between voluntary exchange and legal privilege becomes more than a slogan, because in this case the difference is concrete. Open exchange allows prices to adjust through trade, while legal privilege blocks that adjustment in order to preserve a particular pattern of income and status. You do not have to pretend history gives a perfect verdict, because transitions are messy and historians disagree about some magnitudes, but the pattern is hard to miss. Incentives shape politics, politics shapes rules, and rules shape who bears the consequences. So the invitation here is simple. When you hear a policy defended as stability, ask what kind of stability it is, for whom, and at what cost, and then ask whether the same goal could be pursued through arrangements that rely more on voluntary cooperation than on enforced scarcity. This final slide is where we close the loop by anchoring the story in evidence, because if you want to question dominant narratives responsibly, you need sources that let you verify what you are hearing and follow the trail yourself. For primary sources, the backbone is parliamentary debate records, especially Hansard, because that is where you can see how leaders and members of parliament publicly justified the Corn Laws, criticized them, and framed the moral and economic stakes in their own words. Alongside that, you have pamphlets, speeches, and printed material from the Anti-Corn Law League, which show how a mass movement translated policy into public persuasion. Contemporary newspapers and political cartoons matter too, not because they are neutral, but because they reveal what ordinary readers were being told, what emotions were being activated, and how the issue was being argued in public. And for the hard mechanics of trade, customs records and data on imports and duties help ground the story in the measurable flow of grain and policy. Then, on the secondary side, serious historical and economic scholarship helps interpret the evidence, compare competing explanations, and show where experts disagree. Some works focus on the legal evolution from protection to free trade, others examine political coalition building, others place the whole story in the context of Britain's industrial growth and living standards. The point is not to treat any one historian as the final judge, but to use multiple credible perspectives to see what holds up across methods and ideologies. And that brings us to the takeaway. The Corn Laws are a case study in how institutions and incentives shape outcomes over time, how concentrated interests can lock in policy, and how public organization can sometimes force change, even against entrenched power. If this helped you see the bread question differently, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment so the channel can keep making deeply researched history that actually explains the systems underneath events. And here is the question I want to end with. When you look at the Corn Laws, do you see protection as stability, or do you see it as legal privilege that shifted costs onto people who had the least choice in the matter?